How do you do, everybody? Welcome to a very special lecture. I'm Martin Carver. I'm your chair for this session. Well, now it's a great privilege to be able to introduce you to Duncan Sayer, who's has had a marvelous career. He's professor at the University of Central Lancashire. Now he's going to tell us about some groundbreaking scientific methods that can be used to explore past lives in ways that were completely unprecedented just a few years ago. Duncan is a leading expert in historical archaeology and has a particular interest in early medieval cemeteries, migration, death, burial, and ethics. He's led field work for over 20 years. Most recently, these have included Oakington, famous name now in early Anglo-Saxon archaeology, and Ribchester Roman fort. Duncan is currently collaborating with the DNA labs at Harvard and Max Planck to put together one of the largest ancient DNA projects in Europe. And so in the process, solving some wonderful questions for us. Over to you, Duncan.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Martin. That's a very fine introduction. What I want to talk to you about today is to focus on the question of migration, and in particular early medieval migration based on early Anglo-Saxon cemetery evidence, because as Martin kindly said in his introduction, we now have some really excellent new data looking at ancient DNA that can really give us an insight not just into migration, but also into the people who are migrating, who are traveling into the UK. And I think this is a really important and topical issue, because it's something that we debate quite a lot today, because we're facing a migration phenomenon across Europe as people move around quite a lot. And so it gives us an opportunity really to think about how the past can influence our modern day thinking. And what was really interesting is when we first published the data that I'm going to talk to you about today, lots of the comments that surrounded the newspaper articles in it focused on trying to make sense of those sort of modern conundrums. So I think it's a way that archaeology can really sort of help us think more broadly than just about the past that is in front of us. Okay, so we've now got that. So what I've done is split this presentation effectively into two halves. Part one, where I'm going to talk about burial practices and a background, introduce you to past migration or past approaches to migration, and then some of the past scientific efforts to unpick that migration question. And then I'm going to start talking about ancient DNA, the first projects that tried to do ancient DNA for the second half of the presentation, and it will be over half of my talking, to focus on the new project, the new scientific information, statistics to a lesser degree, and then hopefully really start talking about the cemeteries and the individuals and what it all means, just to give you a sort of account there of how it's going to flow. And I've put those subheadings in across the presentation, so you should see that as it moves past. So the first one then, burial practices. So for those of you unfamiliar with the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries, it's a period of time where people buried their dead in the ground, and that's what archaeologists excavate. Okay, and so we have a series of really nice evidence where we have the soil conditions that can present it. Here, I'm going to refer a few times to the Oakington Cemetery. So I've got some lovely photographs that I own the copyright for, because I took them during the course of an excavation that I ran. And I picked this particular image to sort of talk about burial practices a little bit, because it really highlights the complexity of what we're looking at. So these are 3 individuals buried together in the ground. The skeletons are very well preserved indeed. And you can see in the middle of the adult skeleton there, a series of artifacts that accompany them in the burial. So in this case, we've got about 60 or 70 amber beads. We've got copper circular brooches, we've got knives, we've got a purse set, we've got a purse ring to go with it, a whole host of different things, of different materials ranging from copper, iron, amber, bone, and that sort of stuff. But we also don't get quite a lot of organic material that just simply doesn't survive. So we don't get clothes, particularly we don't get wood, and we don't get leather and that sort of stuff. Okay, these are 3 women. Actually, the DNA tells us that these are all female. Okay, so we've got an adolescent on the left-hand side, an adult on the middle, and a child on the right-hand side, and they're buried with artifacts. It's not untypical, except for the fact there's 3 of them. But what archaeologists have tended to focus on is either the skeletons or the artifacts, and we try and use that to explore the people behind it. But what we often forget are things like this. So this is the adult, and she is putting her hand on the hip of the child next to her. I'll just flip back so you can see that burial position there. You can see the child and you can see her there. And that's an extremely intimate thing. And it's little bits like that, it's little tiny snippets like that that can allow us to start actually seeing these people not as evidence, but as people that lived a life and had a worldview and a perspective and traveled and interacted with each other and had emotions. And I hope very much that things like DNA can start actually putting the skin and the bone, if you like, back together again and recreating that humanity rather than just scientific objects in museums. So as I said, women are often buried with objects like this. So this is a cruciform brooch from Burial 57, also from Oakington, from a woman in her sort of 20s or 30s. This is a lovely object. Complicated copper object. Okay, men often buried with weapons, not always, but sometimes. We've got 4 examples here of men buried with swords, spears, and shields to illustrate that. And it's something we can also explore using genetics, because in the past we've often tended to assume that people are men because they're buried with weapons, and people are women because they're buried with brooches. We have to be quite careful of that. And then we create this sort of complicated tableau within the burials, which I was alluding to earlier. Here's another really nice example of that, okay, where we have from Lechlade in Gloucestershire, and a child aged about 11 or 12 holding a baby in her arms. Okay, and you can see the bigger picture on the right-hand side. And again, I put this in here to illustrate that sort of participation in a much wider experience than just a singular burial. There are people here, and those people are from the surrounding community and more broadly, so relatives and friends and slaves and owners and leaders and animals and all this sort of stuff, and they're trying to create an emotive and important response. So we can build up and put that all that evidence together and attempt to reconstruct what's going on. I'm cheating slightly. This is not an early Anglo-Saxon example. Neil Price kindly shared this with me. This is a Viking example from Birka. And this is Birka burial 581. It's now very famous because it was considered that this is an individual was buried as a man because of the weapons that were included in the burial. But genetics recently identified that she was female. And with that comes a huge controversy and a debate that maybe we shouldn't be that surprised at. Can women be buried with weapons? For example, how were people actually dressed? How are these people perceived? And so genetics really starts to open up the diversity that the past can see. This is really how I've started to think about early Anglo-Saxon cemetery archaeology. And what I've done here is taken a picture of the excavation, again at Oakington. So these are my students, and actually my dad standing there with a spear on the right-hand side. So these are my students who are excavating the site, and they're excavating some of the graves. And what I've done is sort of thrown in using Photoshop early Anglo-Saxon artifacts, shields and spears and swords and knives and brooches and cloaks and stuff like that to create 2 tableaus. And these are trying to put the people back in again. Okay, sort of rather than excavating, imagining that they're building the burials, putting the artifacts back in again. And really, this is the point of this exercise, is really to try and make us think that actually the archaeologist is the first person to get close to these individuals since they were buried. And the experience is very similar. You have to climb into that burial. You have to excavate the artifacts, just as you have to climb into that burial to place the artifacts in it, to lay out the body and lay out all of the objects with the person, arrange their clothing and that sort of stuff. In reality, the participants in the funeral, those close participants, would have to kneel down and get muddy and get in there and intertwine with the body to be able to lay it out in the way they are at all. And that gives us that humanity back again. Okay, so I've set the scene there in the way that I think about burial practices. I've introduced what those burial practices are, the period, and the differences. And I'll explore those again a bit later when we get down to the evidence. What I want to do now is talk a bit about past approaches to migration, because during a period where these burial practices were taking place is one that takes place after Romans effectively have left, or the Roman administration of Britain has failed. And so it leaves this potential vacuum. And people like E.T. Leeds, writing in the early part of the 1900s, was exploring this as a migration event that took place alongside the collapse of the Roman Empire. So he sees this as a series of historical source material pointing at individual German tribes moving over into Britain, into the remaining power vacuum. And for him, archaeology then was about piecing together the truth of that historical past. He did that by identifying artifacts and by looking at their distributions and understanding how they fitted into that narrative. Here's a few examples of very simplistically Anglian objects, which are long objects, have a distribution roughly in the east coast of Britain, and in some cases in the sort of northern part of that distribution. When you actually look at the artifact distributions, they're never quite as simple as they were back in 1900. Similarly, he suggests very simplistically again that round brooches may be associated with Saxons. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to locate individuals and objects onto that sort of historical narrative. And here we have the distribution of those round brooches that you can see there. There are a series of problems with that. I'll pick on Oakington as an example because I happen to have an illustration that I made on the right-hand side here, which shows that actually those Cambridgeshire Fen cemeteries, we have a mixture of both long brooches and round brooches. So we either have Angles and Saxons, or actually these artifacts are nothing to do with that type of ethnicity at all, which I suspect is probably more likely. On the left-hand side here, I've got some colours that look at the sort of chronologies. So in the red, we've got the earliest part of the cemetery to the top and the middle of the site. In the blue, the middle phase of the cemetery, and then the yellow one is the latest burials in that cemetery. So it's not even as if we can rely on the chronology to explain that distribution of long and round brooches either. They're being buried at the same time. So perhaps there are other community things that are taking place at that site that allow people their own localized burial traditions and pick the brooches that are going in with the dead, or how to dress them. Okay, and even E.T. Leeds recognised a much more significant problem, and that was that actually the historical account doesn't fit with the archaeological evidence, what he describes as the Kentish or Jutish problem. If the Jutes are in Kent, why are the brooches all from France? Is a summary of that. And we have here on the right-hand side a great example of a Merovingian gold and garnet composite disc brooch found within Dover Buckland in the 1951 excavation. That object is almost certainly Frankish in its style. So it really highlights that sometimes those things don't necessarily map on to the historical narratives that we want to see. Left with these conundrums, from the 1960s onwards, really, archaeologists and historians started to lose faith in the migration model, to the point where very focused scholars like John Hines were starting to think of ways where we might reduce the number of migrants. We might have an acculturation as opposed to a mass migration event. And he started to hypothesize that things like wrist clasps might give us a hint towards that type of narrative. So here we have all of the rivers illustrated in the east of England, in Cambridgeshire, Norfolk and Lincolnshire. And he suggests that the earliest wrist clasps are much closer to the rivers, and the more complicated and later ones are further away. And this shows really the adoption of the style by people who lived there, rather than necessarily the wholesale migration and replacement of populations. So we started getting a much more complicated narrative appearing, where movement of people may not explain the arrival of a new type of material culture in the 5th and 6th centuries. The evidence is quite mixed. So on the left-hand side here, I've got the place name evidence. In red, we have Anglo-Saxon place names. things like ham and ing, which have that sort of Anglo-Saxon origin to them. In the green, we have the location of early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, that's 5th, 6th, and 7th century cemeteries. And in blue, we have the dot at the center of names that have a sort of Celtic or Celto-Roman river names. And actually, what's interesting is in that map, it looks like there's more blue on the left, which might be what you'd expect. But actually, there's a very similar density of blue on the right-hand side as well. So what it sort of suggests actually is that natural places might remain with the same names as they had before the collapse of the Roman administration. So it's an interesting way of looking at landscape rather than necessarily about the movement of people, even if we do see quite a lot of those place names on the right-hand side there of Anglo-Saxon origin. So we also have people like David Mattingly, who's starting to talk about there being pockets of Romano-British survival into the later 5th and early 6th centuries. Perhaps places like Silchester, the big civitas capital in Hampshire, has got radiocarbon evidence that suggests that people in the 6th century were still resident in the middle of that collapsed, fallen, failed town. So maybe there are enclaves then of different sort of histories, different ways of seeing and practicing your marriage systems and your interactions based on a different experience to the one that we're seeing that migrants are bringing. And we really need to try and understand that complexity somehow. So on top of that sort of complex idea, we're starting to think then that there's people start to do science. Okay, so the first attempts to do ancient DNA involved a number of samples. So Fingelsham, Berensfield, Catterick, and Ipswich were all sampled in about 1995. But unfortunately, the DNA actually wasn't good enough at that point. The science wasn't good enough, and almost all of those samples were contaminated, either by excavation or in the lab. And even though they might have sequenced DNA, it turned out to be modern DNA, not ancient DNA, which is much more fragile. Another attempt in 2012, which I was involved in, where we tried to select samples from Appledown in West Sussex. We were really interested in that site because it looks like slightly different things going on in different parts of the cemetery. So are they Anglo-Saxons and Britons? That's what I'm sort of getting at here. And so we sampled it, we identified the samples. The museum said, well, these are our collection. These are our best collection of individuals that we have. So we'd rather you sampled feet, which we did, but unfortunately they're unsuccessful. In part, again, because the science wasn't quite there yet. The way that you extract the DNA and then sequence it wasn't as good as it is today. But also, I think, because now we realize that feet are not necessarily the best places for survival. Okay. So given that the ancient DNA failed numbers of times, people like UCL team, Wheel et al., Thomas et al. Started to try and use modern DNA to look at population histories and try and see if we can extrapolate from Y chromosomes, that's the chromosome that is only found in men, if you can see a mass migration event at some point in the past, in the early medieval period. And what they suggested on a transept across the UK, so it starts in Norfolk, goes across through Nottinghamshire, into the Midlands and into North Wales, and they took a sample basically from dentists. They asked dentists to survey their patients, and if their great-grandparents had also been resident in that town or village, then they would sample them as if they had, as a proxy for people who had lived there for some generations. And what they were trying to do is see if there's any differences across the British Isles, see if they could create a chart to make a comparison and then compare that with the continents. What they ended up with is this Y chromosome chart, and it looks a bit like this when you put it onto a pie charts across those locations across the UK with the haplotypes that those individuals come from. And what they saw really is this significant difference between North Wales and effectively the rest of England there. Okay, and if I go back to this chart again, what you can see on the right hand side is Wales, all the way at the top, Friesland right in the middle there, and then those those market towns and villages, they sampled in the middle. So what they were suggesting then is that actually the DNA indicates, and they used some very complicated statistics to do that, there was between a 65% and 100% population replacement in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries. That was huge when it was published, because that suggests that there was a mass migration, okay? And this is Y chromosome evidence, so mass migration of population present of men. But it didn't chime with the archaeological and historical dialogue at that place. So that team went away again, spoke to some archaeologists, Heinrich Herker being one of them, got involved with more statisticians and tried to start modeling how that might work if we don't look at mass migration, look at a much smaller type of migration event. What they came up with was a title of a paper which they called Evidence for an Apartheid-like Social Structure in Early Anglo-Saxon England. And they suggested that if there is a reproductive advantage to incoming males from the continent, then you might model over the course of about 10 generations a similar sort of 65% population replacement. Now, that requires quite a lot of sexual advantage, I guess, amongst those men, not just bringing a bunch across of shiny brooches, but active social differentiation and organisation within society, for which there is actually very little evidence. So again, it met with this sort of slightly unreally sympathetic archaeological audience who just said, well, let's see some more evidence of this. But it created a dialogue. It also has a big problem, is that by using this apartheid-like social structure idea, they put themselves into a slightly unsavory space in terms of understanding past migrations, because of course apartheid is not ever applied to the past in that way, and it really applies to South Africa. So a very difficult sort of series of papers to explore. At the same time, Leslie et al. Was using modern DNA to look at the fine-scale genetic structure of British population, and looking at 6,000 individuals, just over 6,000 individuals. Again, modern DNA, and was able to spot quite a lot of differences across the regions of Britain. But of course, the big red in England itself could either be explained by the Anglo-Saxon migration, as they would suggest, or by the Industrial Revolution, where we see all of those towns and cities connected, and we see people moving around at great distance. So it's very difficult to use modern DNA to start talking about past population movements. And all of those authors now recognise that that's the case. But they have raised the debate and the bar quite neatly. Into that landscape, into that conversation, comes the first successful attempt to look at ancient DNA. And I was able to supply some of the Oakington samples to this project, which was very nice. This was carried out by the Sanger Institute in Cambridge, in Cambridgeshire, and Stefan Schiffels, who is a collaborator who I worked with across a number of these papers now, was a postdoc at that time. The Sanger Institute found a 8th century Saxon cemetery underneath a plot of land that they wanted to turn into a new DNA lab. And these guys are an impressive team, an impressive lab, because they're the ones that first did the full human genome sequence. So they've got a lot of weight there. They do a lot of really good work. And suddenly they said, well, can we do something with the ancient DNA? And they looked around for early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. And we were very able and happy to provide examples from a few places, but Oakington was the one where we got the better data from. Okay. And here we have results. So I actually sent them about 16 samples. 4 of them came up with really, really, really good genetics. 95% of the nuclear DNA was able to be sequenced, so they pursued that. This is still quite early days in next generation sequencing. So they focused their time and energy on getting as much information as they could from those 4. As it turned out, all 4 were women. Burials number 1, 69, 82, and 95 across the cemetery in those different colours there. What I've highlighted these as is in different colours to sort of highlight the results, really. So grave 1 there on the top left-hand side, buried with a large cruciform brooch, annular brooches, beads, strap ends, buckle, and a knife, is extraordinarily typical of that sort of Cambridgeshire woman aged 25 to 35 with a full set of artifacts. Okay, that's absolutely what you would think of as an early Anglo-Saxon female burial, spot on. Her genetics said that she was most like the Iron Age individuals that we also sampled, which would make her a Romano-British person. 82 and 95 had the least artifacts of the four that we sampled. Okay, and we've got a few brooches and wrist clasps, knives and beads, and 95 was buried without objects at all. Those two individuals were the closest to modern continental Northern European people. So potentially in the terms that we described them in this paper, they are immigrants or the descendants, immediate descendants of immigrants. And then for the bit that I found really exciting, I was very pleased at the time because this paper, the writing of this paper was dominated by the population history, but I was able to sneak in a really good chunk of paragraphs in the middle of it about archaeology. Okay, and the bit that I thought I was most excited about was grave 96, because grave 96, her genetics was a combination of those two, of the Romano-British and the continental Northern European ancestry. And that's brilliant because it answered a whole series of questions in front of me in the cemetery that I've been excavating. And that's that there is interbreeding between those two populations. We're not looking at a genetic replacement. We're not looking at a complete sort of genocide event, but one of mixing. But of course, the reality is that four individuals cannot tell us about anything more than the sort of hypothetical ideas about this in this individual cemetery. And while the population historians can say, well, one person's genetics can tell us about population histories, archaeologists will say, well, we want hundreds to be able to talk about people and populations and past population movements. So we needed to set about looking at more samples. In the meantime, I took some isotope data from those because I was really interested in if we've got these different biological populations interbreeding within this community and then burying their dead in Oakington, what are they doing the rest of the time? And the isotopes, carbon and nitrogen isotopes, which is basically put down in the water and the food that you eat into your bones, and we can sample that and compare it to groundwater levels. We can sample that and compare it to protein levels that we'd expect from fish and meat and vegetables. And what this tells us is that all of those people were eating the same things. So it doesn't matter who you were, they had access to the same sort of food. We can't tell you that people were eating together, but they're eating the same sorts of things. Okay, and men and women were eating the same sorts of things. The isotope people were not very excited about this particular result, but I was, because when we have a difference between the people, to have a similarity in the diet, now that's more interesting than having a similarity in the people and a difference in the diet. And at the end of this, just before COVID hit, we have two publications that I think really struck me as interesting. We have Robin Fleming, historian from Boston College in the States, and Susan Wusthausen, who's an archaeologist from Cambridge. And the conclusion, the driving interpretation of post-Roman Britain in both these cases, that it was a continuity from Roman period into the Middle Ages, that there probably isn't this huge migration event, that we can almost discard it as an idea in the first place. And that, I think, is quite powerful. At the beginning, you know, for the first time, really, even though we knew that this was a mixed conversation, archaeologists and historians are both saying, well, there may not have even been a migration. These are just objects. These are just ideas. So perhaps there's something more like continuity going on. There are other archaeologists who were saying the exact opposite at the time. And I think perhaps the research community was most divided at that point. Okay. So the new project, we've got past the past. The new project, Stefan and I sampled 458 samples. We thought, well, if people are going to say our sample sizes are too small, we'll get a bigger one, and we'll get a bigger one by 100 times. And that did the trick. It took several years to collect the samples. And during COVID, I was able to acquire some, put them up into my lab upstairs. I was able to take more samples from Oakington and to visit and drive around various places to pick up samples. As we went, more and more people offered us samples as well. And as we got our preliminary results, we were able to start presenting those, and people came forward and said, well, we'd really like to give you Dover Buckland, or this site, or this site, or this site, which is excellent. And I had a number of PhD students working on places like Halladine Close anyway in Cambridgeshire, so we were able to get access to those for the genetic sampling. Okay, so 277 of those individuals came from early medieval England. The rest were from Northern Europe, because we wanted to compare them immediately to the people that they're supposed to, places where they're supposed to have come from. Okay, and the early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries are those listed here. So Dover Buckland, Estuary, Polhill, Ely, Halladine Close, Oakington, Lakenheath, West Heselton, Appledown, Rookery Hill, and Worth Mattraverse. And I'll show you various maps of those as we go through the presentation. Okay, this was published in Nature at the end of 2022. It was a huge piece of work to get it there. There was over 72 authors in the end, all contributing samples or sequencing or data. And it brought in Max Planck, where Stefan Schiffel's works now. And we ended up with the data from West Heselton, for example, which was sequenced by Harvard, being included into the project as well. And that was provided by Dominic Powelsland. So we're in a very strong place in terms of the numbers and the quality of the research collaborations and the quality of the data that we were able to get our hands on. We may have seen some of the media coverage of this one. So we were able to get a lot of stuff in the scientific literature, so in Science, in New Scientist magazine, and in the mainstream literature. So we've got articles, several articles actually, in the Daily Mail, the Mail Online, in the Times, in the Independent, and the Metro, and that sort of stuff. But we're also able to produce a special issue of Current Archaeology magazine, the front cover of which is there, issue 392 in November. And actually, fortunately, we've managed to all the sort of magical fairies came on our side, and we're able to publish the print version of that Current Archaeology magazine on the same day as the print version of the Nature paper, which is fantastic. It was a challenge, but it was a fantastic thing to do. And that released a huge amount more personal and intimate individual information, because the Nature paper really focused on the stats, the population history, and then looks at the bigger picture narrative. And in the Current Archaeology issue, what we're able to do is start talking about people and individuals, which is what I'm going to do the second half of this next part of the presentation. Okay, so this is the spatial and temporal sample that we took. The east coast of England there with our early Anglo-Saxon samples on it, and then all of the different samples that we took from continental Europe. And there's on the bottom part of this presentation, you can see that temporal distribution as well. So as many of those samples as possible are immediately in the 5th, 6th, 7th or 8th centuries AD. This is what the geneticists then produce when they've sequenced all of that stuff. They start to try and map that around similarity and difference and create these sort of correspondent analysis charts that look at those differences in the populations and map those onto modern populations, and then try and work out how those two things come together. What they ended up with is the idea that CNE ancestry, so continental Northern European ancestry, is visible in 74% of our ancient populations. And that's a number that's actually very similar to the Y chromosome evidence that we had before, but that's present in both male and female sets. If you do the maths, which they did on this 2016 paper as well, the Oakington for individuals, that's also a very similar number. So it's interesting that despite all that diversity that we were seeing in the science before COVID, different labs come out with different results, is actually the statistics are starting to point, all those numbers are starting to point in the same direction. There's a very significant migration event in the 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th centuries AD. This is what those look like when you start to play with CNE ancestry as a percentage. This is actually quite a complicated illustration, so I'm going to show you 3 illustrations that highlight that much more simply. So this is a distribution of Western British and Irish DNA in the Bronze Age. This is a distribution of Western British and Irish DNA in the Iron Age. And this is the distribution of continental Northern European and Western British Irish ancestry in the early medieval period. And you can see then we have this huge transformation where we go blue, blue, blue to red. Okay, and that's effectively what this chart is also showing us here. But it's also showing us in the middle zone here, there's quite a lot of individuals that are a mixture of those two things as well. So we're looking at a much more complicated picture than simple population placement. What we're also able to do is say roughly where that genetics comes from. And Joshua Granger, who's the PhD student who spent most of the time trying to do the statistics on the secret data that we had to try and make sense of it, was able to come up with this very neat distribution map of all of that continental Northern European ancestry, which is really very interesting. And it corresponds neatly to what E.T. Leeds is saying about Anglo-Saxons and Jutes coming from the continent, with that focus there on sort of Gotland, Denmark, Northern Germany, Holland and the Lowlands, which is very interesting. It's a very neat illustration. What we're able to do is explore how that works at a site level. So here I've done a distribution map where I've shown all of those early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries that we sampled, and then created a pie chart where we can see the continental Northern European ancestry versus the Western British Irish ancestry. This pie chart also includes some small amount of French ancestry, French Iron Age ancestry, as we call it, because it's evident in the French Iron Age as well. What this shows here is if you look, if we look at the east coast of the UK, so start at West Hazelton at the top, and then Oakington, Ely, Lakenheath, Hatherdean Close. Okay, so we're coming down from North Yorkshire right the way through to Cambridgeshire. There is that we have around 75% of the individuals, or the genetics in total, the DNA in that site, in those sites, is continental Northern European. It gets more complicated as we move down into the south, where we have Pole Hill is very similar to that. Okay, but Eastry and Dover, both on the east coast of Kent, have got a mixture. We've got a little bit more Western British Irish DNA, but also French Iron Age DNA. As we move into the west coast of Britain along that south, or the south coast of Britain, and as we move west along the south coast of Britain, we start to see more and more and more Western British Irish DNA. So being on the coast appears to be quite a significant part, and the east coast, effectively facing continental Europe, appears to influence your genetics. Geography is important, I guess. What we can do then is explore that difference and say that actually the Anglo-Saxon migration, rather than being population replacement, is regionally different. Your experience of what's happening in the 5th and 6th century depends on where you are, which is something we haven't really been able to explore before. We're able to compare individual genotypes with artifacts in a way that we've never been able to do before. There's a conversation around, and similar to that which I highlighted with Birka 581 earlier. So are some men, are some weapon burials women, are some bejeweled burials men? And the genetics that we found at places like Dover, Buckland suggest no, they're not. The DNA confirms that the artifacts correspond with the biology, except in one case. West Hazelton grave 122 was a juvenile aged 12 to 15 years old, and he was buried with this equal-armed brooch, small equal-armed brooch. It's a very early burial. He was also buried with a small number of beads. In fact, this is probably one of our earliest burials, 5th century, middle to later 5th century. And so it may be the chronology rather than a difference in the way of approaching dress that inspired this difference. But it is important to note that there is still a variation worth exploring there. We can look at those variations in more detail. So this is here our national sample of Western British Irish versus continental Northern European ancestries, to try and understand if there's a difference between the types of numbers of grave goods they were found with. And there is. Brooches is where that comes up. So women are very differently according to ancestry, slightly. Here's some examples from West Heselton where we can explore patterns there. At West Heselton, we have a series of weapon burials. So you can see them in red here in a T shape. So these individuals are men, all buried with weapons. And actually what's interesting about that is biologically, a cluster of men are all related to each other in the center of that cemetery. So it's more likely that rather than it being gender that's identifying these individuals as being buried with weapons, it's because they're all related to each other. They're all part of the same family. This is a practice for significant male figures to be buried in the central place in the biggest plot in the cemetery with weapons. Okay. Similarly, at Eastry in Kent, we have this individual here buried underneath a small mound in the middle of quite a wealthy site. This is one of the few princely burials that surrounds the sort of royal centre, one of the royal centres of Kent. Princely burials are wrong. It's one of the elite cemeteries that ring fences the princely sites of Kent. Okay, so we have a significant burial marked out visibly for generations by having a barrow over the top of it. We have a man buried with a seax, placing it in the late 6th or early 7th century. There's a single-sided cutting knife, basically, like a short sword or for cutting, really. Often this would be associated with a weapon burial. Okay, this individual was Western British Irish rather than continental Northern European. So we do see variation in the individuals, even if the statistics tells us there are patterns. And actually males are as likely to be buried with weapons irrespective of your ancestry. So we can try and explore that a little bit further. And actually, if we look at regional patterns, it appears to be it's East Anglia where we see those brooches as different. So we can explore East Anglia a bit. This is Oakington again. We have at those sites, we have some individuals, some significant individuals. So here we have the cow burial. This is burial 80 from Oakington, woman buried with a cow, aged about 25, quite a short woman. Now that's a really interesting burial because it's so unique in so many different ways, but she's still buried with little silver disc brooches and amber beads. So it's very typical of that sort of middle years female early Anglo-Saxon burial tradition. She was about 40% continental, 40% continental Northern European. Okay, so that means that she's 60% Western British Irish. She's a hybrid, but her genetics indicates much more of her ancestry is local. We can look at cemetery patterns. It appears that actually quite a lot of this statistics is being driven by Hatherdene. Here in the green, we have all of our Western British Irish individuals who are not buried with very many artifacts, whereas in the red, we have artifact burials who are also continental Northern European. So perhaps where we have integration, some sites like Oakington, we have separation at other sites like Hatherdene. We can explore the sort of complexity of those weapon burials at West Heselton and start talking about quite complicated family histories there. But there are no real differences other than that men are buried with weapons and that related people are buried with weapons at West Heselton. There are no real differences between the genetics and artifact distributions. We can start looking at how that works locally on that pattern, and actually I've highlighted already this T-shape of weapon burials. But what's quite neat is that on the other side, burial 77, this blue burial here, is a male burial surrounded by others next to two barrows, so a significant individual. He is Western British Irish ancestry and he has no weapons at all. So perhaps for some people, those are quite significant associations. Appledown in West Sussex, we're able to explore as well. And we can see a difference again between orientation here, east-west orientation, and the presence of artifacts and genetic makeup, which is quite fun. That can be seen. So our east-west graves in red there, our south-north graves in black, and then we've got our older individuals on the right-hand side in the middle here in black and red, and we've got our children in yellow. So what it appears to be is older individuals and children buried together with the artifacts, who are more likely to be of continental Northern European ancestry than those buried on north-south axis around them. There's the artifacts to show you that those artifacts are more likely to be in those central places of the cemetery, and there's east-west burials. And then we've got more likely to have skeletal trauma, that is breakages to your bone, or signs of swelling and infection from the bone, or that sort of thing. If you're in that surrounding north-south group, you're also more likely to have been Western British Irish in that surrounding north-south group. So it's likely that we've got then is a continental Northern European family in the center of the cemetery, surrounded by their wider community of people drawn from all sorts of different backgrounds who did most of the labor. So I'll skip the Oakington one there, just because I want us to just sort of say, yes, we get some sites like Hatherdean and like Appledown where we have difference, but we have some sites with integration. And one of those examples of integration is Dover Buckland, and this is a fantastic example. We were able to get 72 petrous bones from Dover Buckland to sample, which gave us a huge coverage. So this is the distribution of all the samples that we took and the artifacts from those graves. And we're able to see family histories across 5 generations. And that's unprecedented for the period. It's absolutely brilliant to be able to see that. And what it highlights is that there's this point here where we have burial 291 and burial 340, where we have a man with no artifacts whatsoever, who has continental Northern European ancestry, who has children with a female, with no artifacts, who has Western British Irish ancestry. And from that point on, their children are a hybrid of those two. And it's those children that have ancestry. And there is another point at which in this marriage here, this unsampled individual here, where her daughter, 429, increases her amount of Western British Irish ancestry. Okay, so this is a multiple burial event that integrates those two genetic haplotypes quite neatly together. And it's later down in those generations that we see those artifact burials starting to be more prevalent. And what we can do, that I quite enjoyed, was plotting those onto the distribution map of graves. And here we are. Okay, so those first generation individuals at the top of that chart here are buried all together in this cluster down here. You can see those burials in the 200s. Okay, but what we end up with is one of our female burials. Oh, if I go back, after a while, actually, I can't remember which one it is, 452, there you go, 425, or 444, 414, sorry, is buried over here in this group. We don't know who the father of her children is because he was unsampled, but it's likely he's over here. Her youngest child in death was buried over here, 305, next to his grandparents and aunties and uncles. Okay, whereas her adult children, those that survived to adulthood, are buried over here in the same part of the cemetery that we speculate her husband, their father, would have buried in. So what we can see really is a point where we get this sort of endogamous marriage situation within the Dover community, but effectively the movement of a female for marriage into that space, and also a point where we have a child belongs to her mother's community until reaching a certain age, and this child sadly didn't pass that particular age, and so was buried with her aunts and uncles. And those ones did. And presumably those adult children buried their mother in this community that they felt more associated with. That's really nice to be able to start mapping those things out. They can play out in a number of ways. So this is Dover grave 250, and she has a V haplotype. What's neat about her is that she's one of the wealthiest burials in the cemetery. But that V haplotype is completely unique in our 72 individuals. So her mother, her aunts, her sisters are not there. Even her daughters are not there. Okay, she has this gold bracteate that was found on a bead chain around her neck that is almost certainly of Northern Norwegian design. It could be a local one, and that's interesting. And Sam Leggett, who did the isotopes on her, also confirms that she is more likely to have been living in Scandinavia up until the age of about 12. So here we have an example of exogamous marriage, where someone from a wealthy Norwegian family has married into a Kentish family where she settled and eventually died. And she's either been buried with an object that comes from a homeland, that bracteate, or the people of Dover, the community that she married in made one as closely as they could to the examples that they'd seen in Norway, and she was buried with that. And that's quite neat, because that does actually associate artifacts and identities quite closely together. Got two siblings from Lakenheath, buried together in the same pit. Sadly, they were quite young. One slightly older boy on the right-hand side, one slightly younger girl, about 9 to 10 and 11 to 12, the two of them. Buried at the same time, died at the same time. And what's interesting, for the first time, I'm wrapping up, Martin, don't worry. For the first time, what we can see there is an individual that we can recognize as their father, who is buried just a few hundred yards away, a few yards away. So we might be able to see actually who did bury the dead. And he was 45 plus when he died, so he almost certainly did bury them. And then finally, I think the individual that received the most press coverage of all has now been called Up Down Girl. And this individual was also from Eastry in Kent. She was also aged about 12. She was buried with a pot and a comb, and 33% of her genetics points to West African ancestry. So we can not only look at big picture migration from continental Europe, but actually start to see a lot of interpersonal mobility as well, and contact with places, presumably through Byzantium, that appear to be much far flung and distant. And that's really interesting. She was buried next to her female relatives, her aunts, and they're all buried in the same early Anglo-Saxon way with artifacts. I think that's really interesting. So she was buried like these individuals of continental Northern European ancestry, and they would almost certainly have been aware of her ancestry as well. But she was buried as part of their family in this wealthy elite cemetery. And there she is. There's Up Down Girl, photograph that I managed to get out of the slide films a couple of weeks ago. So the first time I've been able to display that for this presentation. And there we go. I think we'll end there. So we've got time for some questions. There's quite a lot of information there. The summary says it's damn sight more complicated than we thought, and there is evidence of migration, and that evidence provides a huge amount of us to talk about over the next generations of archaeologists and try and unpick what it actually means for those people and for those communities. Thank you
so much. I think we've been very privileged today. This is a groundbreaking piece of research, and congratulations to you and Stefan and all the other people who've been working on it. You've generated a lot of questions, but I just think there are some themes here. I think what's so brilliant about this piece of work is that it's taken a very confusing piece of history and given us a picture of it in sort of three levels. There's the big picture of the migrations, which we've been arguing about for heaven knows how long. And then there is the community of the cemetery, and the community of the cemetery it has been a little bit neglected. I think people have been rather inclined to talk about the Anglo-Saxons as though they were sort of all the same. And then at the bottom level, so to speak, at the individual, what lovely stories you're producing. I mean, they are absolutely wonderful. They make people come alive because they're individual people, and they have their own lives and have their own events in their lives, and they marry in different people and so on. So it's a wonderful picture that is coming on. So some of the questions really are about what next, but I'm just going to leave those for a minute because I think we need to just address some of these other things. First of all, I think a sort of important question asked by someone called Bob: how confident are you that you can tell the difference between Anglo-Saxon and Viking DNA? In other words, how good are your dates? I think really is the answer, is the question.
Well, I mean, I would say what's the difference between an Anglo-Saxon and a Viking apart from the dates? In reality, they come from very similar parts of the world.
I think that's what they're getting at.
Yeah, exactly. They're just, we've got radiocarbon dates for most of these, so that's pretty good. And we've got artifacts for almost all of these. So we can be confident of that. One of the things that we do is that we have quite a lot of Middle Saxon cemeteries in our sample. And actually some of those like Linton and Hixton are almost all continental Northern European ancestry. So this generally suggests to us that what we call the migration period isn't long enough. That actually we can push it into the Middle Saxon period, if not later. And so it's more likely actually that the Anglo-Saxon migration, if you want to call it that, ends up dovetailing very neatly onto the Viking migration. It's just that at this point, what's changed is England has changed because people have become Christian, and so they're no longer viewing the incoming people in the same way that they did 3 or 4 generations ago. So I would actually suggest that it's continuous.
I think many of us are interested as well at another level on how people related to each other. So let's say take a community like Kingston. We've brought up to believe that this was a violent clash. And you're quite right in saying that this has been a theme all the way through. There are questions here about, okay, there's intermarriage. Is it forced marriage? Can you detect whether there is coercion going on here? Can you detect whether there's any antipathy? Can you throw any light from the archaeology on whether people are seamlessly merging, or whether there is some more sinister activity going on?
I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? It's very difficult to see that sort of thing archaeologically. But what is interesting is that some of those female burials that come from outside of their immediate communities are some of the wealthiest burials in those places. So if it's forced marriage, why are they being buried so lavishly in comparison to the others? I think that what we're also seeing is that the people who are burying them are treating with them exactly the same sorts of respect in terms of where they're placed and how they're placed. So I think that they are fully integrated members of the community. There is a slight difference, as I said, in the amount of artifacts that we see in Western British Irish females than the other individuals. So there is definitely a slight differentiation taking place there. But I wonder whether that is actually because Western British Irish burial traditions are slightly different, and actually people are respecting those when they're burying their dead, okay? Because those individuals also represent the ones we have fewest of. So it is probable that there are enclaves that we haven't yet identified of communities where they can marry into the 6th century, into an ostensibly continental Northern European community that's been there for several generations, and still be primarily Western British Irish in their own genetics. And that's being reflected in how they're being buried and treated, rather than, I think, coercion.
I think one of the brilliant results has been as well that women are coming over, and in fact, they are the ones who are most ornamented in the cemeteries.
Yeah.
This is more like a partnership migration then. Do you think these are families going 180 degrees away from the apartheid model? Do you think these are families that are coming over together and in groups?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, exactly right. I think that's what the genetics points at, because we've got women and men being treated the same with continental Northern European ancestry, where we have first generation from isotope data and the immediate ancestry from genetic data. So absolutely, yeah, it's men and women and probably their children as well coming across at the same time. So we can move away from that sort of elite warrior idea of an invasion to more of a folk migration, I think, really, and one that takes place, as I said, not necessarily instantly, but over quite a long time. Once a community is established, it seems to maintain its relationships overseas and probably extends them, and then continues that sort of migration by having different camps on either side of the North Sea.
And Wallace observes that the project sample sites are quite coastal or near to the coast. Do you think this may show some bias in your results? Well, I would say not bias so much, but is there a indication, is the DNA clever enough to tell us where particular groups are coming from? And or do they, in other words, do they arrive somewhere and then split up and colonize places that are later called East Anglia and Mercia and so forth? Or is it simply geographic? There's more people coming from France, nearer France. There's more people coming from Denmark, nearer the East Coast, higher up.
Mm. Well, so what's interesting, we can't do more than say continental, Northern European or French. Iron Age ancestry or Western British Irish. You can't differentiate, because if you look at that little patch of Northern Europe where most of our samples demonstrate they're related to, it's so close together, it'd be very difficult to separate those. But the Iron Age, the French Iron Age samples come in slightly later. And so that does seem to be linked with the arrival in the late 6th and 7th century of more Merovingian artifacts in places like Kent. That ancestry is seen both in the Western samples and in the Eastern samples. So you can be primarily Western British Irish and have French Iron Age ancestry, and you can be primarily continental Northern European and have French Irish ancestry. And that's quite interesting. It adds a certain dimensional to that. So yes, geography is important, but we also see that French Iron Age ancestry across the whole set of samples as well. So it's a sort of a second migration event taking place in conjunction with this new wealth and connection to the continent, and that's what's driving it.
I could just nip back to the earlier evidence on which we relied so much, i.e. the brooches and so on. Mm-hmm. Jane Williams makes the comment that the different types of brooches could simply be a question of personal preference, couldn't they? And I just wondered whether the ADNA was mapping onto different types of brooches.
No. Simply, nope. We played with it. No.
So
there's not enough of
so she's right, really, isn't she? It's a bit like a modern population in which the origins of a person and what they wear are independent variables.
I think so, yeah. But we do see some of that selection. So I think it's really important that Dover burial 251 has the gold bracket, because that really does point to her origins. Okay, so it may not be that those objects that we have traditionally looked at, like brooches, suggest ethnicity in the way that we've used them in the past, or the way past archaeologists have tried to do that, but it may be that there are other more subtle expressions of identity that we haven't traditionally explored that do, and I think that's important. So, why is the cow burial so different to everybody else? It's not because of her brooches, it's because she's buried with a cow and she has significant amounts of Western British Irish ancestry that make that stand out. And that is quite interesting as well. It's that CX burial from Eastry, that 100% Western British Irish buried amongst continental Northern European women with the CX. I mean, yeah, that's extremely unusual, I think, and really interesting.
Well, this marvelous piece of research, I must say, has given us much more to think about. I do think that having the big picture and also the small stories is going to change the whole character of the way we write about the early Middle Ages, and about time too, really. Do you want to just reflect at all on the future? We had a couple of questions. One person said the Hinckley Pass Station cemetery, 5th, 7th century cemetery, it might be a good subject for ADNA, and David B asks, so what's next for this type of research?
So what's next for us? I think the most obvious question is about these relationships. So once you've looked at the migration, you go, okay, actually the thing that seems to be driving migration, the thing that seems to be driving material cultural choice, the things that be driving change in those cemeteries is how people are related to each other and the generational interaction. So I've gone back to Dover and I've sampled 100% of the 94 cemeteries. So we've now added all the rest of those burials to it, 124, I think, more samples, and Oakington as well. So I've now gone up from about 24 samples to about 80 samples there. I've also looked at all the infants and children from those two sites as well, because we were just targeting adults. And I think that's going to be a huge thing, because we're going to be able to really talk about differences in the way that those communities are organised and interacting. You know, we'll be able to track down the father of those children and look at those multiple generational interactions across time and space. And that, I think, is going to change the way we look at cemeteries completely. And I think it's going to change the way we talk about migration completely.
I'm sure you're right. It's 7:05. I know people will have to go. So it just remains me to thank you so much for this marvelous talk, for opening so many doors. I think it's been a tremendously important piece of research. And all the prospects are that it's going to tell us more and more about people who will become more and more familiar in our lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Martin.